A 67-year-old father sat on the icy bench of an empty train station discarded like yesterday's trash, his breath fogging in the night air as the last train vanished into the dark. Gregory, the smug man who had promised a ride home, had driven away without a glance, leaving him stranded with nothing but silence and humiliation. The sting of betrayal cut sharper than the wind. Yet beneath the ache was a fire. Gregory thought he'd abandoned a powerless old man. But he had no idea what storm he had just unleashed. Stay with this story. Subscribe now, because what comes next will leave you stunned. Earlier that day, before the cold night and the empty platform, the father had woken to the soft light filtering through his curtains. His apartment was small, modest by any standard, but it was his sanctuary. The smell of cinnamon clung to the kitchen, the byproduct of an apple pie cooling on the counter, the same recipe his late wife had perfected decades earlier. He had followed it to the letter just as she once did, measuring every spoon of sugar with reverence, peeling each apple as though it were a fragile memory in his hands. On the table sat a vase filled with daisies cut from his garden that morning, their white petals crisp against the green stems. He thought of Michael, his only son, and felt that familiar mixture of pride and heartache. Michael had called the night before, his voice carrying a nervous edge he couldn't quite disguise. "Dad, why don't you come over tomorrow? Sarah and I want to see you. Sunday dinner, like old times." The words had warmed the father's heart, but there was something behind them, an undercurrent of strain, like Michael was asking not just out of love, but obligation. Still, the father had said yes, clinging to the hope of closeness, of being welcomed. At 67, those moments mattered more than anything else. As he tied the ribbon around the pie tin and placed the daisies carefully in his bag, he thought of his wife, Eleanor. She had loved Sundays, loved the ritual of gathering the family around the table, setting out the good china, laughing at stories retold 100 times. Her absence was still a wound, raw and unhealed. He could almost hear her voice that morning, urging him to take the pie, telling him that family bonds could always be mended with food and warmth. But the silence of the apartment told him otherwise. The train ride to Michael's part of town had been uneventful, but the father found himself lost in memories as the city slipped by. He remembered the day Michael was born, the way Eleanor had squeezed his hand so hard he thought his bones might break, the way tears had filled his eyes when he first held his son. He remembered the nights of overtime shifts, the years of working 2 jobs to keep a roof over their heads, to make sure Michael never wanted for anything. The sacrifices had been endless, but they had always felt worth it because they were for his boy. He arrived at the modest apartment building carrying more than flowers and pie. He carried decades of devotion, of unspoken love, of a father's pride, hidden behind a stoic exterior. Michael greeted him at the door with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked thinner than before, his shoulders weighed down by some invisible burden. Still, he hugged his father tightly, as though for that brief moment he was once again the boy who had clung to his dad's leg at the first day of school. Inside, the apartment bore the marks of quiet struggle. The recliner that had once dominated the living room was gone, replaced with a mismatched chair. The shelves looked barer, the decor a little cheaper, as though items had been sold off piece by piece to cover costs. The father noticed, but said nothing. He knew pride was fragile, and Michael's pride had always been easily bruised. Instead, he handed over the pie and the daisies, watching as his son accepted them with a quiet nod, his hands trembling just slightly. Dinner was a muted affair. Michael tried to keep the conversation light, asking about his father's health, his garden, the neighbors he still saw around town. But there was a heaviness in his tone, a hollowness in his laughter. The father answered with patience, but his eyes never stopped studying his son's face. The dark circles under his eyes, the way he picked at his food without eating. He wanted to ask, to demand the truth, but before he could, Gregory filled the silence. Gregory, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, spoke with that false warmth that always set the father on edge. He cracked jokes, laughed too loudly, then steered the conversation back to money. Bills, groceries, the cost of rent. His words were weighted, designed to remind Michael of their financial strain. The father sat silently observing his jaw tight. He saw his son's shoulders shrink with every jab, every dismissive chuckle, and he felt a flicker of rage beneath his calm exterior. He tried to interject with a gentle word, a reminder that Michael's certification program was a worthy pursuit, a way forward. He spoke with quiet conviction, praising his son's intelligence, his resilience. But Gregory only smirked, twisting his mouth into something between a smile and a sneer. His voice dripped with condescension as he countered, dismissing Michael's efforts as impractical, too costly. The father's mind drifted back again to Eleanor's faith in Michael, her insistence that he was destined for more. She had believed in their son without hesitation, and now here was Gregory dismantling that belief with every word. The father's chest tightened with grief and fury, and for a moment he wished Eleanor were there, if only to see through Gregory's act as clearly as he did. The pie was served, but the sweetness couldn't mask the bitterness in the room. Michael forced a smile, thanking his father for the dessert, but his eyes never lifted from his plate. The father wanted to reach across the table to take his son's hand and remind him of who he was, but Gregory's presence loomed like a shadow, suffocating every attempt at warmth. After dinner, as Michael washed the dishes in silence, Gregory lingered at the table with the father. His words shifted, his tone calculated. He spoke of the future of aging, of the father's modest apartment, and his inevitable decline. He suggested pooling resources, sharing responsibilities, his smile sharp and predatory. The father kept his face impassive, but inside a storm brewed. He recognized the move, the manipulation disguised as concern. It was a tactic he had seen in boardrooms and business deals, but never in his own family. When Michael returned with coffee, Gregory's mask slipped back into place, all charm and false warmth. But the father had already seen behind it, glimpsed the cold calculation in his eyes. He stayed polite, sipping coffee, keeping his voice calm, but every word burned with silent fury. He knew Gregory's type. He had underestimated men like this before, and each time they had learned their mistake the hard way. Later, when Gregory offered to drive him to the station, the father accepted with quiet reluctance. He had no idea then just how cruelly that ride would end. But as he stepped out into the night air, daisies and apple pie lingering in memory, he knew one thing with certainty: the bond between father and son was still there, fragile but unbroken, hidden beneath the weight of manipulation. And as much as Gregory believed he was in control, he had no idea that he had just provoked something he would soon regret. The night was far from over, and what waited at the train station would turn a father's grief into something far more dangerous. The fork clinked against porcelain as Gregory leaned back in his chair, his voice cutting through the thin air of the apartment like a serrated blade. He had a way of speaking that turned every sentence into a grievance, every word dripping with disdain for the life he claimed was too heavy a burden to carry. Bills were piling up. Groceries were outrageous, utilities impossible. He spoke as though the very act of living were an injustice committed against him. His words didn't ask for sympathy. They demanded it, painting him as a victim of circumstance, while casually stripping Michael of dignity with each passing remark. Michael sat hunched, shoulders caved inward, as though each jab from Gregory pressed him further into silence. His fork hovered above the plate, pushing peas into a small pile that he never lifted to his mouth. The faint light above the table reflected the hollows under his eyes. The fatigue that spoke of long nights and longer days, the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than physical strain. Every time Gregory sneered at another expense, Michael's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The silence was deafening, filled with what wasn't said, with the words that hung unsaid between father and son. The father watched it unfold with the stillness of a man who had seen storms gather before. He studied Gregory's body language, the deliberate way he gestured at the apartment, as if pointing out the deficiencies that Michael had failed to correct. The mismatched furniture, the second-hand chair that sagged in the corner, the absence of the leather recliner Gregory had once boasted about. Gregory didn't just complain about money. He used it as a weapon, reminding Michael of what had been lost, what had slipped through his fingers, and what Gregory believed was now owed. The meal itself became secondary, each bite tasteless against the steady rhythm of Gregory's complaints. He made a show of cutting into his food, the knife scraping the plate with unnecessary force, his smirk widening each time Michael stayed silent. "You really think this program of yours is worth it?" Gregory asked, his tone drenched in mockery. "How much more are you going to waste before you realize it's a dead end?" Michael's face flinched so slight it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else, but not by the father. He had raised that boy, knew every line of his expression, every twitch of muscle that betrayed what words couldn't. He saw the hope flicker and dim, saw the weight of disappointment settle across Michael's features like a shroud. It was the same look he had seen years ago when Michael at 12 had missed the winning shot in a school game and hung his head as if the world had collapsed. The father's chest burned with the memory, the urge to protect his son as fierce now as it had been then. The father cleared his throat, his voice calm but sharp. "Michael's certification is an investment. He's always had a gift for focus, for learning. That's something worth believing in." His words were measured, but they cut through the air like a blade. Gregory's smile tightened, his eyes narrowing just slightly, a flash of irritation breaking through his performance. "Easy for you to say." He countered, his tone slick with venom. "You're not the one writing the checks. You're not the one trying to keep the lights on. It's not ambition when it comes at the cost of survival." The father didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, let Gregory's words hang heavy in the air, and in that silence he saw Michael's knuckles whiten around his fork. It wasn't just exhaustion weighing him down, it was shame. Shame that wasn't his to carry. But Gregory had pressed onto him like a brand. The father leaned back slightly, his eyes never leaving Gregory's. He saw the calculation behind every word, the way Gregory was planting seeds of doubt, not just in Michael's mind, but in the room itself. This wasn't casual complaining. It was strategy. Each remark was designed to erode confidence, to carve out control from weakness. And the father recognized it for what it was, because he had seen men like Gregory before in workplaces and boardrooms and alleyway deals that promised fairness, but delivered only theft. Michael attempted a weak defense, his voice low and uneven. "It's just temporary. Once I finish, things will get better. We'll manage." But Gregory's laugh was hollow, cruel. He shook his head as though speaking to a naive child, his words slicing through Michael's fragile hope. "Better. Look around, Michael. Do you see better?" "Because I don't. I see bills stacking up and a wife chasing some fantasy while I drown in reality." The father's hand tightened around his glass, the faint clink echoing as he set it down too firmly on the table. His heart pounded with fury, not just at the insult, but at the way Gregory's voice dripped poison into every corner of the room. He glanced at Michael again, at the quiet desperation in his son's face, and knew that if something didn't change, Gregory's words would do more than sting. They would hollow him out until nothing was left. The rest of the meal passed in fragments. Gregory's voice always louder, always sharper, until it felt like the walls themselves carried his complaints. Michael barely spoke, each silence another wound. The father's eyes flickered to the daisies resting in the kitchen, forgotten their petals, beginning to wilt. He thought of the apple pie cooling on the counter, untouched, its sweetness wasted in the sour air Gregory had filled. He thought of Eleanor again, of her belief in family as salvation, and wondered what she would have said to a man like Gregory. By the time the plates were cleared, the tension had woven itself into every fiber of the room. The father remained still, outwardly composed, but inside he was already cataloging Gregory's moves, already planning the counter-move. He knew what was happening. He knew manipulation when he saw it. The only question was how far Gregory was willing to go and what price he believed his cruelty could extract. The coffee was poured, the conversation shifted, but the damage had already been done. Michael's silence had spoken louder than words, and Gregory's smirk carried the confidence of a man who believed he had won the evening. The father sipped his coffee slowly, his mind sharpening with every bitter swallow. Gregory thought he had silenced the table, but he had no idea what kind of silence he had stirred awake. And as the evening drew to a close, with Gregory offering that too perfect smile, the father's eyes caught the faintest glimmer of something else. A crack in the mask, a glimpse of the predator beneath. He filed it away, his pulse steady, his thoughts precise. Gregory believed he held the power now. But power has a way of shifting, and the father knew the shift was coming. The ride to the station would reveal just how deep Gregory's game ran and just how badly he had miscalculated. Gregory's laugh was sharp, a sound without joy cutting through the room like broken glass. Michael's face faltered, his eyes lowering to the half-empty plate before him, the muscles in his jaw tightening as though he were bracing for another blow. In that instant, the father felt something deep inside him shift, a weight pressing against his chest, anger burning hot beneath the surface. He had seen his son endure disappointment before, but this was different. This was cruelty disguised as just arrogance dressed as authority. It wasn't just words, it was the deliberate grinding down of Michael's spirit. The father's hand tightened around his fork knuckles, white. Yet when he spoke, his voice was steady, controlled, even warm. "Michael's program is no waste," he said quietly, but every syllable carried the edge of steel. "He's always been determined, focused. He's the kind of man who doesn't stop until he finishes what he starts." His gaze cut across the table, resting firmly on Gregory, his tone unshaken, almost conversational, but the undercurrent was undeniable. It was a defense, a reminder, and a warning all in one. Michael glanced up, startled, a flicker of relief softening the lines of his face. For a heartbeat, he looked like the boy he once was, the boy who had come home with scraped knees and found reassurance in his father's steady hand on his shoulder. But Gregory's smirk widened, a predator sensing resistance. He leaned back in his chair, his voice dripping with mockery. "Determined, focused. That's one way of looking at it. Another way is reckless. Ambition's a fine thing until it ruins you. He's dragging us down with fantasies he can't afford. You don't see that because you don't live here. You don't pay these bills." The father's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. His eyes held Gregory's, refusing to give ground. "Bills are temporary. Education, ambition, those last. Michael is building something, and I will not sit here and let you belittle him for trying." The words were calm, but behind them lay the fire of decades, years of sacrifice, years of work, years spent building a life so his son could stand taller than he ever had. He would not let Gregory strip that away with a sneer. Gregory's face hardened, his smile turning into something colder, his voice lowering. "Easy to cheer from the sidelines when it's not your money on the line. Maybe you don't see it, but I do. This isn't noble, it's selfish. He's gambling with both of us just so he can chase some dream that should have stayed in college." Michael shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening around his fork. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but the words died in his throat. The father felt his heart ache at the sight. His son, once so full of confidence, now sat silenced by the weight of Gregory's disdain. The memory of Eleanor rushed through him, her voice insisting that Michael could be anything, her unwavering faith when the boy stumbled, her laugh that never let him forget his worth. To see that belief now mocked, dismissed as recklessness, was a wound too deep to bear. The father's anger burned, but it was not reckless rage. It was focused, precise, like a blade honed on stone. "You mistake restraint for weakness," he said softly, almost a whisper, "but do not mistake my silence for consent. My son's future is not yours to dismantle." The room fell quiet, Michael's eyes widening, Gregory's smirk faltering just slightly. The father leaned back, his expression calm but unyielding. Inside, however, a storm raged. Every fiber of his being screamed to protect his son, to shield him from Gregory's corrosive words, to remind him of his own strength. He could feel his heart breaking at the sight of Michael's bowed head, but alongside the heartbreak was something else. Something colder and far more dangerous: determination. He thought of the years spent working long nights, the countless sacrifices made so Michael could have choices he himself never had. He remembered the pride in Eleanor's eyes when Michael graduated, the celebration they shared, the dreams they whispered about their son's future. That pride had not dimmed with time. It had only grown stronger and fiercer, as though the years themselves had sharpened it into resolve. Gregory reached for his glass, his arrogance returning with each sip of wine, but the father had already made his choice. He would not fight here, not now, not with words that would bounce off Gregory's armor of self-importance. Know this battle would be won differently, with patience, with precision, with a plan that Gregory would never see coming until it was too late. He looked again at Michael. His son's shoulders slumped under the weight of Gregory's scorn, and silently vowed that this would not stand. Gregory could laugh, sneer, mock all he wanted. But he had crossed a line tonight, a line no man should cross. He had underestimated not just Michael, but the father who would never stop protecting him. The father took another sip of coffee, the bitterness settling on his tongue like a promise. Outwardly, he appeared calm. His words spent his defense quiet but firm. But inside, beneath the still surface, something dangerous had awakened. He had endured much in his life, but nothing stirred his resolve more than seeing his son broken. The evening pressed on conversation, shifting clumsily to safer topics, but the damage lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. The daisies in the corner drooped under the weight of neglect. The pie on the counter grew cold and forgotten, and the father sat in silence, eyes steady, mind already working. Gregory believed he had won this round, that his words had crushed the room into submission. He had no idea he had just lit a fuse, one that would burn quietly for now, but with each passing moment grow hotter, brighter, until it erupted into a fire that would consume everything he thought he controlled. The night was not over. The station awaited, and with it Gregory's cruelest move. But what Gregory did not yet realize was that the man he believed to be a powerless old father was already calculating his response, already shaping the storm that would one day bring him to his knees. The father's eyes lingered on the dim glow of the kitchen light, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence as the table conversation slipped into shallow pleasantries. On the surface, nothing seemed out of place, but inside him memories stirred heavy and relentless. He remembered every quiet act, every hidden sacrifice that had kept Michael's world from collapsing long before Gregory ever noticed a late notice or an empty wallet. Anonymous envelopes slipped under doors. Grocery store gift cards tucked into birthday cards disguised as small tokens of affection. Payments made directly to utility companies under false names, ensuring the lights never went dark, the heat never failed in the dead of winter. Michael had never asked for help, never begged for support, and that was exactly why the father had given it without acknowledgement. Pride was fragile, and his son's pride was worth protecting. Gregory sat across the table, now puffed up with the smug assurance of a man who thought he saw the whole picture. His complaints about money dripped with entitlement. His posture relaxed, his tone accusatory. Yet he had no idea. No idea how much of their fragile stability had been underwritten by the very man he dismissed as old and irrelevant. Gregory's arrogance was a mask for ignorance, and the father's silence was its own weapon. He let the man talk, let him gloat, all the while measuring just how blind Gregory really was. The father's mind drifted to colder nights. The winter Michael had called sounding tired, his voice strained as he explained that their heating system had broken down. He had insisted they were managing, that it wasn't urgent, but the father knew better. The next morning, without saying a word, he had arranged for a repairman to show up at Michael's apartment, the bill already covered. He remembered the sound of gratitude in his son's voice when Michael called him later that week, unaware of who had made the call, thanking him only for visiting the weekend before with groceries. The father had smiled, saying nothing, content to let the secret remain his alone. There had been times when the debt collectors' voices grew louder, their letters more frequent. Michael never admitted the pressure, but the father had intercepted more than one notice redirected from the mailbox by careful hands that knew exactly what to look for. He had walked into banks with checks already written, telling himself it was only temporary, that one day Michael would find his footing and never need such help again. And he had believed it because belief in his son had been the core of his existence since the day Michael was born. Now, watching Gregory dismantle that faith with smirks and derision, the father felt sadness press against his ribs like a stone. Michael had no idea how much had already been sacrificed, how many times his father had pulled strings in the background to make sure his son never fell too far, never hit the ground completely. Gregory believed he was the one carrying the burden, that Michael's ambitions were an anchor dragging him down. The truth was far crueler. Gregory had been standing on a foundation built quietly, steadily by the very man he now tried to belittle. The father studied Michael's face, the exhaustion there, the defeated slump of his shoulders. It wasn't weakness. It was the weight of someone who had fought too long without relief, who had tried to build something honest while being dragged down by the manipulations of a man like Gregory. The father's heart broke at the sight, but within that break there was steel. He had not endured decades of sacrifice, only to watch his son's spirit crushed by arrogance. He thought of Eleanor again, her faith in Michael unshakable even in the hardest years. She had often said, "We may not always have money, but we will always have resilience." He had lived by those words, turned them into a quiet mantra as he worked through nights, missed meals, and gave up comfort so Michael would never feel the full sting of deprivation. That hidden strength was still within him, dormant, but far from gone. Gregory thought he was exploiting an old man too tired to fight back. He had no idea the kind of endurance built from decades of quiet struggle. The father sipped his coffee, the bitterness biting at his tongue, grounding him in the present. He let his gaze move to Gregory, holding it steady, unblinking. He wondered what Gregory would do if he knew the truth, that the man sitting across from him had more than enough resources to end his charade in a single stroke, that the sacrifices had not been made because the father was weak, but because he chose silence for the sake of dignity, for the sake of letting his son believe he was standing on his own. Gregory thought he was circling prey. He had no idea he was already inside the cage. The sadness weighed heavy. Yes, but behind it was resolve. A resolve that had been forged in harder fires than Gregory could imagine. Nights spent counting every dollar, days spent burying grief in work, after Eleanor's passing, years spent ensuring Michael would never know the sharp edge of hunger. Gregory believed control was his, but the father knew better. He had outlasted worse men, colder winters, harsher storms. The room was filled with the faint clatter of dishes, the smell of pie cooling untouched, the distant hum of traffic outside. On the surface it was a quiet Sunday evening, but inside the father's mind, plans were forming, lines being drawn. Gregory's ignorance was his weakness, and the father would use it. He would not announce his intentions, would not fight with raised voice or heated words. He would do what he had always done, work in silence, move with patience, strike only when the moment demanded. He looked at Michael one last time before the evening waned, before the train station waited with its own cruel lesson. His son's eyes were tired, but somewhere behind the fatigue still burned the boy he once knew. The boy who believed he could be anything, who dreamed bigger than his circumstances. That boy was worth protecting, worth every sacrifice already made and every sacrifice still to come. The father felt the sadness harden into something unbreakable. He had spent years in the shadows, giving quietly, carrying silently. Now, watching Gregory gloat, he realized the time for silence was ending. The night ahead would demand more than quiet sacrifice. It would demand action. And when it came, Gregory would discover just how much strength lay hidden behind the mask of an aging father. The station was waiting, the dark corners where betrayal would bare its teeth. What Gregory thought would be his triumph would become the beginning of his downfall, because the father's resolve was no longer hidden, it was sharpening, ready to strike. The moment Michael excused himself, the air in the room shifted. The faint sound of running water came from the kitchen sink, dishes clattering gently, the rhythmic scrape of a sponge against porcelain. Gregory leaned back in his chair, swirling the last inch of wine in his glass, his eyes fixed on the father with a smile that was anything but warm. It was the smile of a man who thought he had engineered privacy, who believed he had earned the right to drop his mask. "You know," Gregory began, his voice low and almost confidential, "these years can get tricky. Social Security doesn't stretch the way it used to. Medical costs rise. Housing isn't cheap. It's only natural that we start thinking about pooling resources." The father didn't move. His face remained calm, his posture unshaken, but inside fury roared like a storm pressed behind glass. He knew this tone, this rehearsed rhythm, the way Gregory tilted his words to mimic compassion. It was the same tone men used when they wanted to strip you of your dignity while pretending they were doing you a favor. Gregory leaned closer, resting his elbows on the table, his smile tightening. Michael's under pressure, you see. And at your age, maybe it's time you think of easing the burden. Living alone, keeping up with bills, it doesn't look sustainable. We could consolidate. One household, one set of expenses. Everyone benefits. The father's eyes narrowed just slightly, a shift so subtle it might have been mistaken for the play of light. His hands remained steady around his coffee cup, but his mind was slicing through every word, dissecting the truth hidden behind the false concern. Gregory wasn't talking about family. He was talking about control. He was laying out a plan where the father's independence became a liability, where his very existence was reframed as a drain. Gregory continued, his confidence growing in the silence. You've done your part, raised a son, worked your years. But holding on to that apartment, those accounts, it creates division. If you moved in with us, combined what you have with what we're managing, it could secure the future for everyone. Think of it as a family safety net. The father's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Every sentence dripped with the same poison: give up what you built, surrender the fruits of a lifetime, and let me hold the reins. It was theft dressed in concern, exploitation wrapped in family language. The father felt Eleanor's voice in his mind, steady and clear. Never let them mistake generosity for weakness. He set his cup down carefully, the porcelain barely making a sound against the table. His voice, when it came, was calm, measured. That's an interesting thought. Gregory smiled wider, emboldened, mistaking patience for agreement. He leaned in further, his words quickening. Exactly. It's practical. We all know what happens when older folks try to manage too much alone. Bills pile up, mistakes get made. I wouldn't want to see that happen to you. I'm just thinking of Michael, of the family. If we act now, we can prevent a lot of hardship later. The father watched him closely, noting the slick cadence, the carefully chosen phrases: older folks' mistakes, hardship. Each one a knife pressed to the skin, testing how deeply it could cut. He felt his anger rise, but he did not let it surface. His calm expression remained intact, but inside he was cataloging every word, every smirk, every angle of attack. Gregory tilted his head, lowering his voice even further, as though confiding a secret. You're sitting on resources, aren't you? A pension savings? Maybe something more. That's what I'd do in your shoes. Use it wisely. Consolidate, invest in what matters. We could take the stress off Michael's shoulders. He doesn't need to know the details yet. This could just be between us. The father's fingers curled under the table unseen. The sheer audacity of the man, the gall to suggest siphoning off what had been built over decades of sweat and sacrifice, it was breathtaking. He felt the heat in his chest, the surge of protective rage that had first flared when Gregory mocked Michael. But this was more than mockery. This was predation. Gregory wasn't satisfied with control over the present. He wanted the future too, and he thought he could seize it by cornering an old man with the language of care. The father leaned back slightly, his face still composed, his voice carrying just a trace of curiosity. And what exactly would that look like? Gregory pooling resources. Gregory's eyes gleamed. He mistook the question for interest, his eagerness breaking through his mask. It's simple. You move in, let go of unnecessary expenses. Roll your accounts into one household budget. I'd manage the finances, make sure nothing gets wasted. Michael doesn't have a head for this stuff, but I do. It would free him up. Let him focus on his work instead of drowning in numbers. We'd all be better off. The father nodded slowly, as if turning over the idea. He even allowed the faintest trace of a smile to touch his lips, though it never reached his eyes. Gregory saw what he wanted to see, a man beginning to bend, beginning to surrender. But inside, the father's fury crystallized into something sharper, colder. He had spent years sacrificing in silence, keeping Michael afloat without ever asking for thanks, protecting his son's dignity, even when it cost him dearly. And now here sat Gregory, daring to frame him as a burden, daring to suggest that his life's work be handed over like loose change. The sound of water stopped in the kitchen, and Michael's footsteps approached. Gregory leaned back quickly, his mask sliding into place once more. By the time Michael stepped back into the room, the predator's gleam was gone, replaced with the polite smile of a man who appeared invested in family conversation. The father lifted his coffee again, his hands steady, his expression unreadable. He offered no sign of the storm raging beneath his calm exterior. Michael sat down unaware of the exchange that had just taken place, unaware that while he washed dishes in the sink, Gregory had tried to dismantle the foundation of his father's independence. Gregory thought his words had planted seeds, that his insinuations had taken root in the quiet soil of an aging man's uncertainty. But what he had truly done was something far more dangerous. He had stripped away the last veil, revealed his intent in stark clarity, and in doing so had triggered a resolve the father had kept buried for too long. The night moved on, conversation shifting to shallow topics once more, but the father's mind was elsewhere, his fury hidden behind the mask of composure. Gregory believed he had made progress. He had no idea that he had just declared war. The ride that followed would show just how ruthless Gregory was willing to be, and it would reveal just how far the father was prepared to go in return. The offer came with a smile, smooth and practiced, a performance of generosity that fooled no one. Gregory jingled his car keys, insisting he would drive the father back. His voice dipped in false concern. Michael, too tired to argue, thanked him with the kind of gratitude that comes from habit, not clarity. The father simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He knew better than to refuse. It would only make him look stubborn or worse, ungrateful. So he took his coat, tucked his silence around him like armor, and followed Gregory out into the cool night. The car was spotless, smelling faintly of expensive leather cleaner, a small empire Gregory treated with more reverence than any human relationship. He held the door open with exaggerated politeness, the same way a wolf might lead a lamb into a clearing. Once inside, the father settled into the seat, the hum of the engine vibrating under his feet as the city lights smeared across the windshield. The silence stretched, broken only by the rhythmic click of the turn signal and Gregory's occasional hum, a man far too pleased with himself. For the first few miles, Gregory played the role of dutiful son-in-law. He asked about health, about aches and pains, about how lonely it must be living alone. Each question was coded in sympathy, but the father heard the sharp edge underneath. These weren't questions born of care. They were reminders, each one hammering at the same message. You are old. You are fragile. You cannot stand on your own. The father offered short answers, his voice, even his gaze, fixed on the dark horizon. He would not give Gregory the satisfaction of a reaction. But inside, the words carved through him, fueling a slow, steady fire. He had faced harder truths than this in his life, endured losses far greater than Gregory could imagine. Age was not weakness. It was history, and history had a way of arming those who carried it. The city fell away, replaced by stretches of quiet streets lined with closed storefronts, their neon signs flickering out one by one. The drive grew longer, curiously so. The father glanced at the dashboard clock. The last train of the evening would have left by now, but Gregory showed no rush. Instead, he took the long way, winding through back streets with deliberate aimlessness. Finally, the car slowed, pulling into the near-empty lot of the station. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows on cracked pavement. The platform beyond was deserted, the tracks stretching into darkness with no train in sight. Gregory put the car in park and turned to face the father, his smile widening. "Here we are," he said lightly, as if dropping him at the station at this hour were the most natural thing in the world. "Guess you'll have to wait for the morning train." His tone was almost playful, but his eyes were sharp, watching for the flicker of fear, the crack in composure. The father stepped out, the chill of the night hitting him squarely as the car door shut with a hollow thud. He stood there, bag in hand, staring at the empty platform. The hum of the engine faded as Gregory rolled down the window, leaning toward him with a mock sigh. "It's tough, isn't it? Out here alone, no one around, no way home. Makes you think about the future, doesn't it? How much harder it'll be without someone to lean on." The words hung in the air, cruel in their precision. This was no oversight, no accident. Gregory had orchestrated it, had chosen this moment to illustrate his point that without him, the father was vulnerable, stranded, powerless. The father looked back at him, his face calm, almost serene. "I'll manage," he said, his voice steady, giving nothing away. Gregory's smile twitched, irritation flashing for a split second before he covered it with mock cheer. "Of course you will," he said, shifting the car into gear. "Take care now. Don't catch a chill." With that, he drove off, the taillights shrinking into the distance until they vanished altogether. The father stood alone in the buzzing silence of the station lot. The air was cold enough to bite at his fingers, the kind of night that seeped into the bones. Around him the world was empty, lifeless, save for the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere beyond the tracks. He walked slowly toward the bench, its metal surface icy against his legs, as he sat, his bag placed carefully at his feet. For a moment he let the reality sink in. Abandoned. Stranded. Gregory had staged the scene to perfection, reducing him to a solitary figure in a forgotten corner of the city, as though to say, "This is what you are without me." Vulnerable. Exposed. But Gregory had made a mistake. He had assumed that vulnerability equaled defeat. The father sat in the silence, his breath curling into the night, and allowed the anger to settle into something colder, sharper. He thought of Eleanor, of her unyielding faith, of the sacrifices he had made in silence. He thought of Michael, bowed beneath Gregory's disdain. And he thought of Gregory himself, so sure of his power, so convinced of his control. The father's lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. Gregory believed he had delivered a lesson, but all he had truly done was reveal his hand. Every predator eventually showed its teeth, and once you saw them, you knew where to strike. The bench creaked beneath him as he leaned back, his eyes fixed on the empty tracks stretching into the dark. Tonight was not defeat. Tonight was revelation. Gregory had mistaken silence for weakness, age for frailty. But the father knew better. He had survived more ruthless men than Gregory, endured storms that would have broken him long ago if he were truly fragile. Somewhere beyond the horizon the morning would come. And when it did, Gregory would learn that the man he thought he had humiliated was not prey. He was patience embodied, biding his time. The night at the station was only the beginning. The real lesson was yet to come. The station was a hollow shell lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes that painted the cracked pavement in ghostly shades of white and gray. The father sat on the bench, the cold metal seeping through his coat, and for the first time in decades he felt truly exposed. His hand dipped into his pocket, fingers brushing against the few bills folded there, $17, nothing more. No phone, no ride, no home within walking distance. Just the still night, the echo of a car engine fading into silence, and the knowledge that he had been left here deliberately discarded by someone who wanted to prove a point. The humiliation was sharp, piercing, deeper than the chill of the air. He had fought through layoffs, through nights of hunger, through Eleanor's illness, and the loneliness that followed her passing, but none of those moments had carried the sting of this one. Those battles had been with circumstance, with life's cruelty. This was different. This betrayal bore his family's face, carried their name. Gregory had made sure to twist the knife with precision, showing him what it meant to be powerless, to be old, to be in the way. The father leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his breath rising in thin clouds. He felt the weight of the years pressing down on him, every sacrifice he had made, suddenly mocked by the cold reality of $17 and an empty station. He saw himself as Gregory must see him, a man out of time, a burden disguised as kin, and for a moment the weight of it nearly broke him. But grief and humiliation, when pressed hard enough, have a way of hardening into something else. Beneath the vulnerability, beneath the ache of betrayal, something colder began to stir. Strategy. Not the loud, reckless kind born of desperation, but the quiet calculation of a man who had survived too much to ever stay down. He had built his life on discipline, on patience, on the ability to endure while others faltered. Gregory had mistaken that for weakness. Tonight, sitting alone under buzzing lights, the father began to see it for what it truly was, a weapon. He lifted his head eyes, scanning the deserted lot. The silence was oppressive, but it gave him space to think. He replayed Gregory's words at the table, the sly pitch of pooling resources, the veiled threats disguised as concern. He replayed the drive, the deliberate detour, the final smug smirk as the car pulled away. Gregory had staged all of it to craft a single message: without me, you are nothing. But the father knew better. He had been nothing once long ago, before Eleanor, before Michael. He had built everything from the ground up. He had clawed his way through worse nights than this. And men who build from nothing never forget how. He reached into his bag, pulling out the ribbon from the pie he had brought earlier. It was just a strip of red cloth, but he wound it around his fingers, grounding himself. Eleanor had chosen that ribbon once for a birthday gift, her laugh warm as she tied it in a bow. Holding it now was like holding a promise, a reminder of what he had fought for all those years. Gregory thought the father was alone. He wasn't. He carried Eleanor's faith with him, carried Michael's worth, even if Michael himself had forgotten it. That was enough. The night deepened, the temperature dropping each minute, stretching like an hour. He shifted on the bench, his back stiff, his hands tucked into his sleeves for warmth. Vulnerability was real, yes, but it wasn't permanent. It was a mask one Gregory had forced on him. But masks can be ripped away. He knew what Gregory didn't. The resources tucked away in accounts Gregory had no knowledge of, the assets carefully shielded, the contingencies built over years of cautious planning. He wasn't the broke, stranded old man Gregory wanted him to believe he was. He was a man with options, with leverage. And now he had something more dangerous than wealth. He had motive. A faint sound echoed through the lot, the scrape of footsteps. He looked up to see the station guard making his rounds, flashlight sweeping across the cracked pavement. The father raised a hand in greeting, his voice calm, steady, betraying none of the storm inside. The guard nodded, moved on, leaving him again in silence. But the moment was enough to remind him he was not invisible, not erased. The world still saw him, even if Gregory chose not to. He sat straighter on the bench, the ribbon still wound around his fingers, the fury in his chest cooling into resolve. Gregory had wanted to teach him a lesson about vulnerability. What he had done instead was reveal the contours of his own cruelty, expose the depth of his greed. That knowledge was more valuable than any weapon. Now the father knew exactly what he was up against, and more importantly, he knew Gregory's weakness, his arrogance, his certainty that he had already won. The father smiled faintly, the kind of smile no one sees in the dark. Gregory thought he had abandoned a powerless man to the cold, but he had in fact given birth to something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose, and every reason to fight back. The station clock ticked toward midnight, each second sharpening the father's focus. He had no phone, no ride, no warmth, but he had clarity, and that was worth more than any convenience. The humiliation would linger, yes, but humiliation can be alchemized into power. He would not forget this night. He would carry it with him like a blade, and one day soon, Gregory would feel its edge. The wind cut sharper, rattling the loose metal siding of the platform. The father pulled his coat tighter, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the tracks vanished into black. He wasn't waiting for a train anymore. He was waiting for dawn, for the chance to rise. For the moment the game shifted back into his hands. Tonight he had been made to feel vulnerable. Tomorrow Gregory would begin to learn what it meant to provoke a man who had built his life on endurance, on sacrifice, on silent strength. The cold might bite, the night might stretch long, but none of it mattered. The strategy had already taken root. And as the first hints of morning crept along the horizon, the father knew with absolute certainty Gregory believed he had staged a lesson in powerlessness. But what he had truly done was awaken the kind of resolve that only men forged in fire can wield. The reckoning was coming, and it would arrive with a precision Gregory would never see until it was far too late. The guard noticed him first, a tall young man in a navy jacket with a badge that seemed almost too big for his frame. His flashlight beam caught the father's face, and for a moment suspicion flickered in his eyes, the way it does when someone out of place lingers too long in the wrong setting. But then he saw the old man's bag on the ground, the way his shoulders sagged against the cold bench, and his voice softened. "You all right, sir?" he asked, careful, not prying. The father straightened, pulling dignity around himself like another layer of clothing. "I'll manage," he said, though the words were brittle in the air. The guard lingered uneasy, then shifted his flashlight toward the empty tracks. "Last train left hours ago," he said quietly, as if confirming a secret everyone already knew. "It gets cold out here at night. Too cold." He hesitated, then added, "There's a staff lounge inside. Not much, but at least it's warm. Coffee if you want it." The father almost refused. Pride always tempted him to. But the boy's earnestness pierced through his armor, and he nodded once. The guard smiled, almost relieved, and gestured for him to follow. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and a faint heater pushed stale warmth into the air. The lounge was nothing more than a break room with a dented coffee pot and 2 folding chairs, but at that moment it felt like a cathedral. The father accepted the styrofoam cup of bitter coffee with quiet gratitude. The guard left soon after, back to his rounds, but the simple gesture lingered. Hours passed. The station settled deeper into silence, the kind of stillness that feels eternal. The father sat alone in the lounge, the clock ticking loudly on the wall, his thoughts circling back to Gregory's smirk, to Michael's bowed head, to the cold edge of betrayal that cut sharper than the wind outside. The bitterness remained, but it was tempered now by the memory of the guard's kindness, a reminder that not all people looked at weakness and saw opportunity. Some saw humanity. It was close to dawn when she arrived. Rosa Martinez, the cleaning lady, moved through the station with the practiced rhythm of someone who had spent years turning chaos into order. She was small, wiry, with streaks of gray in her hair pulled back tightly. Her cart rattled softly across the tiles, her mop sweeping in broad strokes. When she spotted the father sitting alone, her brow furrowed. "You've been here all night?" she asked, her voice firm but not unkind. He nodded, and she shook her head, clucking her tongue. "Cold night for that. You'll get sick." She disappeared for a moment, then returned with a blanket from her cart, worn but clean, and draped it across his shoulders before he could protest. The warmth was immediate, startling in its intimacy. He looked up, searching her face for pity, but found none. Only practicality, only care. "You got family waiting?" she asked as she wiped down a table. The father hesitated. The truth clawed at his throat, bitter and heavy. "Not tonight," he said finally, the words carrying more weight than he intended. Rosa studied him for a moment, her eyes sharp, but she asked nothing more. Instead, she poured him a cup of tea from her thermos and set it in front of him without ceremony. "Better than that station coffee," she muttered, returning to her work. He sipped it slowly, the warmth spreading through him. Gratitude swelled in his chest, not for the tea or the blanket, but for the reminder that decency still existed. That even in the face of betrayal, humanity had not abandoned him. Rosa didn't know his story, didn't need to. She saw only a man left in the cold and chose to bring him warmth. It was simple, but it mattered more than she could know. As dawn broke, pale light seeping through the station windows, the father sat wrapped in Rosa's blanket, the taste of her tea still on his tongue. He felt the humiliation of the night still burning, but it no longer hollowed him out. Instead, it carved a sharper edge, honed his resolve. He thought of Gregory again, of the arrogance that had led him to believe cruelty was strength. But cruelty was fragile. Kindness, small and quiet as it seemed, endured. The father closed his eyes briefly, letting the fatigue wash over him, but beneath it all was something steadier, stronger. Gratitude had mingled with determination, hardening into resolve. He would not forget the kindness of strangers, because it reminded him of what was worth fighting for. And he would not forgive the cruelty of family, because it reminded him of what had to be destroyed. The station clock ticked past 6. The world outside stirred, awake cars beginning to move on distant streets, the first train of the morning rumbling in from the horizon. The father rose slowly, folding the blanket neatly and placing it on Rosa's cart, though she waved him off. He slipped the red ribbon from his pocket again, winding it around his fingers, a ritual now a reminder. The night had shown him the depth of betrayal, yes, but it had also shown him the persistence of decency. Gregory had left him in the dark, hoping to teach him weakness. Instead, the darkness had given him clarity. He was not alone, not broken, not finished. He was sharpened. As the train pulled in and the door slid open with a hiss, the father stepped forward. His stride measured, his expression calm. The reckoning had already begun, though Gregory didn't know it yet. The kindness of strangers had steadied his hand. The cruelty of kin had given him reason. And now, with the dawn rising, the father knew exactly what had to be done next. Rosa sat across from him on her break, her mop propped against the wall, the thermos of tea between them. The father's hands were steady now, wrapped around the cup she had given him, the steam curling up into the thin morning light. For hours he had been silent, a man weathering humiliation in the shadows of a forgotten station. But as dawn stretched its pale fingers across the floor, something shifted. His eyes, once clouded with weariness, sharpened. He looked at Rosa, at the kindness that had expected nothing in return, and he felt the weight of truth pressing against his tongue. "Gregory thinks I'm finished," he said at last, his voice low, measured, almost contemplative. Rosa tilted her head, listening though she asked no questions. "He believes I'm an old man with nothing left. $17 in my pocket, stranded like a stray dog." That's the picture he painted. He set the cup down, the porcelain making a faint sound against the table. But Gregory made a mistake. He reached into his coat pocket, not for money, not for proof, but for the small red ribbon he had carried all night. He wound it around his fingers, his gaze fixed on it as though it were a tether to something larger. "I am not broke. I am not helpless. And I am not done." Rosa's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing, her silence granting him room to continue. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a new edge, quiet but sharp, like the scrape of steel being honed. "What he doesn't know is that while he's been busy parading his arrogance, I've been building. Investments, properties, accounts with his name nowhere near them. I've played the fool because sometimes it's easier to let men like him believe they're smarter than they are. But the truth, I'm wealthier than he could ever imagine. Stronger too, because I know what it means to sacrifice, to endure. Gregory has never endured anything in his life. He's soft, and soft men break." Rosa leaned back in her chair, studying him. Her silence was not disbelief but recognition. She had seen men like Gregory before, loud, boastful, cruel. She had also seen men like this father, quiet, deliberate, carrying storms beneath their calm. She nodded once, a gesture of respect more than agreement. The father drew a long breath, steadying himself, his voice even lower now. "He left me here to teach me a lesson about vulnerability. What he's done instead is teach me exactly how far he's willing to go. That is his mistake. Because now I will show him how far I'm willing to go." His eyes were cold, the warmth of gratitude mingling with something sharper, something lethal. Gregory will learn what it means to betray a father, and he will learn it the hard way. Rosa reached across the table, her hand brushing the back of his, not as comfort, but as recognition. "Then don't waste time," she said softly. "Men like that only grow bolder if they think they've won." Her words hung in the air, not as advice, but as confirmation of what he already knew. The father rose slowly, folding the blanket she had given him, and laying it neatly on her cart. His movements were precise, deliberate, the small rituals of a man already shaping his next steps. He straightened his coat, adjusted the strap of his bag, and stood taller than he had all night. The exhaustion was still there, the ache in his bones undeniable, but layered over, it was something harder resolve. As he stepped toward the platform, the morning train groaned into view, its headlights slicing through the mist. He turned back once, meeting Rosa's gaze. "Thank you," he said simply. She nodded again, her eyes steady. No more words were needed. She had given him warmth when he was cold, tea when he was weary, and silence when he needed to speak. That was enough. The doors slid open with a hiss and he stepped inside. The train lurched forward, carrying him away from the station where humiliation had been planted like a seed. But seeds grow, and this one was already sprouting into something fierce. He sat by the window watching the city stir, awake commuters shuffling onto platforms, unaware of the vow forming in the silence of a single man's heart. Gregory thought betrayal was a weapon. He had no idea it could also be a trigger. The father's mind turned over possibilities, each one sharper than the last. He thought of the accounts Gregory didn't know existed, the properties hidden behind trusts, the leverage he had patiently built. He thought of Michael, of the boy who still lived beneath the weariness, a boy worth saving from Gregory's grip. And he thought of Eleanor, her voice still echoing in his memory, urging him to protect, to endure, to fight when the time came. That time had come. The train rattled forward, steel grinding against steel, each mile carrying him closer to the reckoning. He would not shout. He would not warn. He would move with the same patience that had carried him through nights of hunger and years of sacrifice. He would strike in silence with precision, dismantling Gregory piece by piece, until nothing remained but the memory of his arrogance. As the city blurred past, he allowed himself a final thought of the night behind him, the humiliation, the cold, the $17. He would carry that memory not as shame but as fuel. Gregory wanted him to feel powerless. Instead, he had forged something stronger. The father closed his eyes briefly, his lips curving into the faintest smile. The vow was clear, etched into his very being now. Gregory had underestimated the wrong man, and when the storm finally broke, it would not come with noise or warning. It would come with silence, precise and devastating, and Gregory would never see it until it was far too late. Betrayal cuts the deepest when it comes from family, and this story reminds us of a truth many older Americans know too well. Kindness and cruelty can both hide behind familiar faces. The father was abandoned, humiliated, and left to feel powerless. Yet in that moment of darkness, he discovered something critical. Strength doesn't vanish with age. It sharpens. His decades of sacrifice, quiet resilience, and careful preparation became the very tools that turned vulnerability into strategy. For those in their later years, the lesson is clear. Never underestimate the value of your wisdom, your endurance, and the foundation you've built. Even when others dismiss you as weak, you carry the power of experience and the right to protect what you've earned. And just as importantly, the kindness of strangers shows us that humanity can still shine through the bleakest moments. Life will test you sometimes through the hands of those you love most, but those trials can remind you of your strength and sharpen your resolve. If this message resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts. Your voice matters, and your story could inspire someone else to rise stronger.